Hi, in this video we're going to take a look at determining the relative, or also known as the local, maximum and minimum coordinates. So a relative, also known as a local maximum, so relative maximum or local maximum, is going to be the highest point in some open interval in the graph of our function. So it's typically going to be the top of the hill for many functions. So for the most part, we'll see it looks like the top of a mountain, so to speak. However, that's also assuming that there isn't a hole in the graph at the quote-unquote top of the hill. Sometimes we like to put a hole in the graph at the top there, which would not have a relative or a local maximum at that point. We also have another type of maximum called an absolute or a global maximum, which is the highest point in the entire domain of the function. So if we take the entire domain of the function into account, we could have an absolute or a global maximum, although that's not a guarantee. So you want to give your answer for finding any kind of maximum, well, whether it's relative or absolute, as an ordered pair, so an x-coordinate and a y-coordinate. On the other side of the spectrum here, we have a relative or local minimum, which is the lowest point in some open interval. And that's typically going to be a quote-unquote bottom of the valley for many of our functions. And again, we're assuming that there isn't going to be a hole in the graph there. An absolute or global minimum is the lowest point in the entire domain of the function. So our relative maximum and relative minimum is in some open interval. The absolute maximum, absolute minimum is the entire domain. So the relative or local maximum or minimum are usually a subset of the absolute or global. And again, we want to give our answer as an ordered pair, so an x-coordinate and a y-coordinate. So let's take a look at example 2. We have our graph here. Determine the relative minimum and relative maximum, and then determine the global minimum and the global maximum. So here we have our graph, and we'll start with our relative minimum, which our relative minimum is going to be the lowest point in some open interval, which we'll typically see as the bottom of a valley. And here we have a bottom of a valley at the point 3, -8. So our relative minimum for this function is 3, -8. Our relative maximum is going to be the top of a hill, so to speak. So we have, in this interval here, we have the highest point as -2 and 4.5. So our relative maximum, sort of a top of the hill, is at -2 and 4.5. Globally, our absolute lowest point on this graph also happens to be the point 3, -8. So not only is it a relative minimum, but it's also a global minimum as well. So if you take a look at all the points on this graph, the absolute or global minimum is at this 3, -8. Our global maximum is the highest point that we see in this entire domain, which in this case, the highest point is at 6 and 5.5. So our global maximum is 6 and 5.5. Notice it's not the same coordinates as our relative maximum of -2 and 4.5. All right, so that about does it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.